Senator Roberts, you have the call.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for coming today. And Mr Outram, I acknowledge the difficulty and the challenges you face and the way in which they appear to be faced. It's an increasingly complex circumstances in which you deal, and every time you make an improvement, I'm sure the people you're trying to chase and hold accountable will make an improvement as well. So it'll never stop. My questions are to do with asylum seekers. Is it true, Mr Outram, that currently around 80 asylum seekers per day arrive in Australia by air?
No, I'm not aware of that statistic, Senator. Let me just go to some data that I do have. The Department of Home Affairs, of course, they retain all the high-level data around people who come to Australia and claim protection.
Senator, if I might, it might assist the committee if both Ms Golightly and the Commissioner's offices work together, because the visa issuance, as I've said several times today, is a matter for the department, and then the travel component of it is a matter for the ABF. But they work very closely together, so you've got the experts at the table. Perhaps the rate of arrivals, that goes to Senator Keneally's earlier questions, I might ask Ms Golightly to speak to that, and then the Commissioner and his offices perhaps might go to more matters to do with the actual travel component.
Mr Mansfield, do you need a hand? You sure? Okay. Beg your pardon, Mr Pizzula.
Incredibly resilient officers that we have. You should see the other guy.
Wasn't you, was it?
Senator, as mentioned in earlier evidence, in fact I think the Secretary's opening statement, over the last 4 or 5 years, the rate of people who come in to the country and then claim asylum is about 0.23%.
So how many people would that be in a year?
Well, we might be getting the figures for the year. I know in that period it was about, that same sort of 5-year period was 92,000.
Asylum seekers?
Yeah, people who claimed asylum.
That's very high, isn't it?
Out of 40-odd million people coming in.
So I refer you, Senator, to my opening statement. Inclusive of the financial years 2014-15 through to the most recently concluded financial year, that is to say 18-19, in relation to a flow of 40 million persons who arrived on temporary and indeed permanent visas, there were 92,000 applications out of 40 million for protection onshore, as we describe it. That is to say, protection claims lodged once you've arrived and you've cleared the border or you're at the border. And as Ms Golightly said, that represents 0.23%, 0.23% of the flow of visa arrivals over that time period.
So that 92,000 figure, that was over the 4 years?
5.
5 years. Okay.
So inclusive of 2014-15, so starting 1 July 14 and concluding on 30 June this year, the stock of persons, the amount of people who, or the number of applications I should say, were 92,000.
No, that is individuals, isn't it?
There you go, 92,000 individuals.
Okay, thank you. How are they allowed to board the flight, or what visas do they come in, enter on?
So they, the vast majority of visas in any 1 year that are granted are visitor visas. Now that's regardless of who then may or may not claim asylum when they get here. But in any 1 year, of course, most people coming to Australia are visitors.
What arrangements are in place with airlines to make sure, to deny boarding flights?
So there's actually quite a number of things we do offshore before people come to Australia. And I think, as the Secretary mentioned earlier, this starts right at the application stage, which is way before someone even arriving at an airport to board a plane. So at the application stage, we have officers all around the world that have a look at the application. And indeed, we have systems that have risk parameters programmed into them based on our experience and intelligence, which highlight those which need closer examination, and our officers will then go through extra steps in checking those applications. So many are refused at that point, and indeed our refusal rates have been increasing significantly year on year. So that's even before someone gets an opportunity to go to an airport. If they are granted a visa and then they arrive at the airport, if we have other information or alerts in place and parameters that allow our ALOs, the officers that Commissioner Outram was just talking about, to identify people at the airport that they may wish to ask further questions of, and there is a certain number that are interdicted then.
So a lot of it is done before they even get to the airline?
That's correct, Senator.
And what arrangements with the airlines are there?
Senator, I might start over from this point. The airline liaison officers, of course, they're posted to a number of, I won't get into which airports they are, because it's obviously, I'd rather not give that out in public, but they're posted to a number of international airports, and they perform really two tasks. One is to check the bona fides of passengers coming to Australia, and obviously they target particular flights. The other one is to actually educate the check-in staff of airlines at those airports so that they're familiar with our requirements and processes. Back here in Canberra, that part of the Australian Border Operations Centre I mentioned is our BOC, or our Border Operations Centre, where we have 24/7 staff, 365 days a year, who are engaging with airlines, checking departmental systems to make sure that before passengers get on an aeroplane, they've got a valid visa. The airline liaison officers, of course, in questioning people, what they're trying to do is ascertain, is the intent for travel the reason that's stated on the visa? So somebody asked a question earlier on about, do they have a return ticket? There's an obvious question, you know, if somebody's coming just for a couple of weeks without a return ticket, that might lead to further questions. They're also trained to look for fake documents and forgeries and those sorts of things, and so they've been between the BOC and the ALOs, I'll give you some statistics. In 2017-18, the ALOs interdicted for fraudulently obtained or improperly documented travellers 205 people. In 18-19, that went up to 387. The Border Operations Centre itself, they actually interdicted in 2017-18 79 passengers, which in 18-19 went up to 179. And where the ALOs recommended an offload because they felt the travel intent may not align with the visa or travel approval, in 17-18 there were 555 cases, in 18-19 1,343, or a 383% increase in the previous year. So these officers are very proactive and very busy trying to make sure that people don't get across our borders here in Australia. Then when people, of course, arrive here, at check-in, we're notified through something called advanced passenger information that a passenger has checked in overseas. And there are a number of checks in place then in our systems to make sure not only they've got a visa, but is there anything known about this passenger that we should be concerned about? And then when people arrive, if there is a matter that's of concern, then our officers at the Australian border will then take over. Of course, when they arrive in Australia, people need to have a valid visa. They need to have a travel document. This is at airports. And of course, we do check at either the primary line or through our smart gates that the person who's got the document is the person who should have it in terms of the face-to-passport match.
So have you noticed any trends either in number of people that you block overseas or who arrive here as a result of the stronger maritime border protection?
Well, as I've said, the numbers in terms of our ALO work have gone up over the last 2 or 3 years. They've been very proactive and doing a great job. Here at the airports, though, the number of unauthorised air arrivals by program year who've been screened at Australian airports after seeking to engage Australia's protection obligations at the actual airport, so before they sort of get through the airport, in 16-17 was 41 passengers, 17-18 62, 18-19 was 60. So those numbers have remained broadly consistent.
Mm-hmm. So what is the government response if this is the new way for people smugglers to get on board? Just keep doing the same thing, tightening up?
Well, I don't think it's a new way. I think it's a way that people have always, around the world, it's not just unique to Australia. People obviously sometimes seek to circumvent border controls. It's very hard to do that in Australia, and I'd say that it's mostly opportunistic and individual cases where people come to try and do that, as opposed to highly organised. In some cases, there's an element of organisation, and we want to look out for that, but by and large, it's sporadic and individual. So I'm not aware of any sort of massively orchestrated campaign here against Australia or our border.
Okay, so if someone gets through, arrives in Australia, what's done with that person? What do they do?
Well, provided they satisfy those requirements for entry, so they've got a valid visa, and we've checked that, and they've got a valid travel document, and they've satisfied the face to passport check, then they have to, of course, they've cleared the immigration part of the primary line. They then have to clear customs and quarantine, which is Department of Agriculture, and once they've done that, then they're in Australia. So they then become, they obviously move around in our community as tourists or students or whatever.
If they subsequently apply then for asylum?
That's then where the department take over.
What's the process then?
So, Senator, I should also mention that, in fact, the numbers, you asked about trends, the numbers overall decreased in the last financial year by 12%. So in terms of the process for somebody claiming asylum, there is an application form, an application that they need to make with various information on it that is assessed by our expert staff that are highly trained and experienced, as the Secretary mentioned in his opening statement, in this very specialised area, and that assessment is made, and the claim is either granted or refused.
Thank you. And what happens to the last question, Chair? What happens to those people the claimants whose claims are rejected?
So the claimants then actually have appeal rights under the law. So a number of things could happen. They could avail themselves of those appeal rights to the AAT or subsequently the courts. They could accept the decision and leave Australia, or they could apply. They may have avenues to apply for a different type of visa. We'd have to look at the circumstances.
And would you consider deporting?
So if they remain here unlawfully, so if they don't apply for another visa and the protection claim has been refused and is not under appeal, then they are unlawful in Australia and would be open to removal.
And I think, Senator, if I might just, by way of very brief supplementary comment, the evidence you've heard across the two sides of the department for the whole end-to-end stream suggests, clearly based on the evidence, that 99.73% of people do not avail themselves. I'm not suggesting that availing yourself of a claim for protection is either a good or a bad thing. It's just factually the case that 99.7% of people do not. In the case of the 0.23% of persons who do, we've talked about the 92,000 over 5 years, the marginal gain that you would achieve in tapping that number down by putting onerous restrictions in terms of students, tourists, visitor visas and the like would be completely disproportionate to the gain that you end up getting, because you end up creating so many disincentives in both tourist, visitor visa, student categories that pain wouldn't be worth the effort. It's not to say that you don't want people put in a position where they're here for a long time, potentially subject to exploitation, which I know has been an important part of the public commentary. But hopefully we've given you an assurance that throughout the end-to-end process, from the time that a person applies for a visa right through to their clearance through immigration control, right through to their being potentially bridged as they go through various steps of lawful review, that it's a very controlled process. The additional effort to try to get that number down to zero is vanishing. You'll get a vanishing small return.
I understand. It's a very important area and can't be 100%, but you're striving for it.
Senator Roberts, I'm going to have to stop you there. We